So today, thanks for joining us for this virtual town hall. I'm Megan Jennings. I'm a research ecologist at San Diego State University and one of the leads of the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project. A while ago, we were talking about the fact that we're about in the middle of this project and we really wanted another opportunity to reach out to potential stakeholders and give you all an update on where we are, or if you've just heard about the project, get a better sense for what it is and what we're doing. And so we decided, because our project is spread out across Southern California and usually traffic and driving places is sort of a headache, we decided to do a virtual format, and then our world changed. And so I'm guessing most of you are joining us from home. And it turns out that this format is very conducive for our current living situation. So I'm glad many of you are joining us, and hopefully if folks are not able to join, you'll be able to see the video later. But the opportunity here is to tell you a little bit about the project if you haven't heard about it before. For those of you who have, give you an update on where we are and where we're going, and to sort of check in on where we are with the project. So the Connecting Wildlands and Communities project is about planning for climate-ready landscapes in Southern California. And this work has been funded by the California Strategic Growth Council through the California Climate Investments Program. So we're really glad to be part of that program. And I'm going to tell you a little bit about how we got here first. So this work all built on work that we've been doing over the last several years to build resilience for our ecosystems in Southern California. And this was an opportunity to expand that perspective to our local communities. So I am a wildlife ecologist primarily, and I do a lot of work on conservation planning and connectivity analyses. And that's where this all started. We were working on a connectivity project for the South Coast ecoregion of Southern California to think about how we could make sure that we were planning for what might come in the future to connect all these wonderful landscapes that we have in Southern California under a future of change. And that work was funded by the California Department of Fish and Wildlife and the Wildlife Conservation Board. And it was a collaboration between San Diego State University and the Climate Science Alliance. So as I mentioned, we focused on the South Coast ecoregion. We wanted to look at this area where we have a diverse amount of lands that are protected, but we also have large human populations. We have rare and endemic species that we're interested in protecting. And that was really the goal of that project. We wanted to make sure all these important species and habitats were connected and could persist under a future of change. And so through that project, we developed some linkage maps. We developed a prioritization tool. We've made sure that this is all available for decision making. This was really intended to provide information in support of conservation planning and decision making. And so some of these tools we've presented, both the data, which is, you see an example of a map here. We've got a story map, and it's also available as an interactive web map. We've done some prioritization that is customizable for our end users to support decision-making for things like acquisitions or for management decisions for natural resource or public lands managers. But in doing that work, we saw that there was a real opportunity to go beyond thinking about conservation planning and integrate the things that affect not only our ecosystems, but our local communities, the places where we live. And that includes things like land use change and land use planning, planning for wildfire risk mitigation, as well as water sustainability. These are things that we often deal with separately, but they all interact. And it's important that we think about how we can better manage these things, both for ecosystem and community resilience. And that's really how we came to this project, was thinking about how we could put these considerations together. And by looking at where we had opportunities and there were benefits through conservation that could help build resilience in our local communities, we wanted to provide that opportunity. And so the idea here is not necessarily to come up with groundbreaking research, but rather to fill gaps, gather existing information, and provide an opportunity to integrate it directly into planning. That's my cat. Sorry about that. So the first step in that process, that was our general idea, but we wanted to hear from folks who would potentially be using this information. And that was really the first step of this project. So about a year ago, or a little over a year and a half ago, we came out to a number of stakeholders asking what you would want to know, how we could think about asking questions, research questions, and bringing together data to support this type of integration for ecosystem and community planning. And so we had several large events, but we have also throughout the process been having smaller group meetings and really had an opportunity to gather feedback, which has informed the direction that this project has taken. And you'll see throughout, as I present some information on our different topic areas, how that feedback has informed what we're doing. And so as sort of that process has evolved, we've landed on, this is essentially what we're working on. We have these different topic areas that I introduced. So we're thinking about fire and water and biodiversity. And within each of those, we're taking the perspective of how can we answer questions that help us better understand those processes and risks and managing for them in our wildlands and our human communities. So eventually we can put the components together. And in a lot of cases, it's very similar information that we need, and it's just a slight perspective change on how we use that information. But we don't want to just stop at having these three separate components, because that's one of the, I think, challenges or barriers to using this information is if they live in silos, it's difficult to integrate them. So as you can see towards the bottom here of this infographic, we have the thought of how can we combine how fire and water interact. When there's a post-fire environment, we have greater erosion, those types of issues. Water and biodiversity, fire and biodiversity, how if we have too much fire, that can affect the vegetation composition and ecological integrity that affects how persistence of biodiversity. So the idea here is really to take these multiple benefits and work on integrating them into planning. And so that planning perspective is really critical. We didn't want this to just be about conservation planning, because one of the key decision factors or key decision makers in how things change across the landscape are city planners. And so we really wanted to make sure that this information was available to local jurisdictional planners. They're the ones that exercise land use controls. And hopefully some of you joining us are from that background. We want to know how you can use this information, and hopefully this is useful to your process. And you'll see how we are striving to provide this information in a way that is most useful to you by assessing the lay of the landscape. I'll talk more about this planning context as we go on, but really how to support decision-making and collect information about how to incorporate your input to deliver a more comprehensive data set that's useful. All right. And I will also mention at the top there, you see a number of the different types of audiences that we hope this information will serve. As I go, you'll see there's a particular focus on jurisdictional planning. I think that's in part because I think there has been a disconnect that we'd like to try and bridge, but our goal is to reach many of these audiences, because I think we all need this kind of information, and the better sort of baseline of information that we have, I think the better we can all work together towards the same end. So that planning context that I mentioned, what I mean by that is a whole suite of different planning perspectives. So if you're at a metropolitan planning organization, in our region, it's going to be SANDAG or SCAG. Regional plan updates, both are undergoing regional transportation plan and sustainable community strategy updates. How can this information serve those processes? Jurisdictions are being tasked with updating hazard mitigation and disaster plans and their general plans. How can our fire and water information serve those purposes? General plan updates, climate action plans. Some of you may have climate action plans in place. Some of you may be working on them or even thinking about working on them. Climate adaptation plans, different than climate action planning. I don't know how many folks are working on these. Certainly many of our tribal partners are very active in this arena. Natural community conservation plans and habitat conservation plans. These are big, important drivers of some of the decision making that we have here in where I am in San Diego, but across Southern California, there's a number of these. And then finally, implementation of all of the above. How can this information better support these efforts and be integrated into these processes. So what I'm going to do now is pause for a moment. Hopefully you all have been joining on Mentimeter and sharing information about who you are and what you think. So let's visit that and see who's with us. All right, so how are you feeling? I thought this was an important question given the current status of things. So it looks like most people are doing all right. Hopefully not too many people stressed and socially distanced. Oh, somebody's a little bit more socially distanced. This is live, so as you answer, we get responses rolling in. And again, you'll see at the top of the screen, if you haven't joined us yet on Mentimeter, you can use the website and the code there to join. You can get some coffee afterwards. All right, so let's see what people were hoping to get out of this town hall. This one sometimes takes a minute to load. Here we go. Update on what we've been doing. We will definitely provide that information, updates. Got my video blocking that. Open to whatever info is presented. I like you. I will serve that purpose. Visualize solutions and future projects for Baja California. Yes, I would absolutely like to think about as we move forward and we work on deliverables for this project, how we can expand our view and cross that border that seems to always stop the data flow, so we can visualize that as one connected ecosystem and connected communities, because we are. All right, so I'll move to the next one. We can make this available later as well, because I know there's a lot to dig in here. Oh, and we can scroll down, look at all these educational information, clear understanding of the work. Yeah, I think we have, and do an interactive polling. Well, you've just done that successfully, so thank you. All right, so where are you located? A lot of folks from San Diego County. All right, well, we do have a lot of connections in San Diego County, as that is where San Diego State is located and our research team is located, but good to see we have folks joining us from the other counties in Southern California, as well as elsewhere in California and outside. Great to see some of you from elsewhere. All right, San Diego, stop, too many of you. All right, so what type of organization do you represent? I think we've got a pretty good mix here, changing a bit as we go, but quite a few from nonprofits and NGOs. A lot of our tribal government folks, thanks for joining us. Glad to see you all here. Oh, we'll have to dig into who that other is. We've got 17% right now. Good representation from federal, state, and local government. Fantastic. We can revisit this again, and I can save the results. So go ahead and keep voting, because we'll be able to visit that. So what is the primary focus of your work? The type's a little bit small. We got quite a few folks from planning. That's fantastic. Doesn't matter what kind of planning, even if it's not jurisdictional planning, we think this information will hopefully be valuable to you. Number of folks from management, I think a pretty good representation across the different fields we hope to connect with. All right, so I'm going to open voting on a new question. And this is just to help me get a sense, and I think all of us, for what you think about the types of information that we're talking about and their value to climate adaptation, because we think this is really the crux of what we're trying to get at, is by thinking about ecosystems and our communities and multiple benefits, that this really helps us all adapt to a changing future under climate change. So go ahead and you'll have to rank each one of these, and then we'll see you know, what you value as most important. And it's fine if you pick just one of these, if that's the nature of your work and the drive of your work. I'm glad to see so many are picking multiple benefit planning so far. Got results rolling in still. If you're not familiar with Mentimeter, down in the right-hand corner here, we can see how many people are have voted. It looks like we got 121 participants, so we'll give it another 30 seconds or a minute or so. I know it takes a minute to sort of select all those drop downs and pick what you think is important. I'm not surprised we have good representation from biodiversity and conservation, folks who think that's important. That's certainly my background. Oh, I see carbon sequestration moving up. That's interesting, because that is a component that we added to the project after hearing from all of you. That was not part of our original vision. I'll talk a little bit about how we've integrated that and our partnership to make that happen. But it was a direct result of hearing from stakeholders that we incorporated that component into the research. Because while accounting for inputs, our outputs, GHG production and mitigating vehicle miles traveled and those sorts of things, right now there's no standardized practice for how we account for carbon sequestration, and in particular, not a great amount of information on the sequestration value of shrublands, in particular chaparral. So we're working on that for you, and I'll tell you more about that as we go. All right, well, in the interest of making sure we have enough time, I can go back and visit these towards the end when we come back to Mentimeter, which we'll do towards the end of the presentation, but I'll move on. But really great to see so many of you really value the idea of this multiple benefit planning. I mean, I think just inherently it makes a lot of sense, because while many of us work in these individual disciplines, ultimately, as I said before, all of these things are connected, and our goal here is to help make that connection in the data and data availability and tools to access that information in the work that you do. We can come back and revisit this and check if we've got any more responses, so feel free to log in and keep responding if you'd like, but I'm gonna go back to our presentation here. Okay, so where are we working? So when I talked about the impetus for this project from the connectivity work, I mentioned that we were the South Coast, we had worked on the South Coast ecoregion, but for this project, we had some limitations in terms of time and funding. And so incorporating Santa Barbara was a bit more challenging. So we removed that piece. And so then we considered what we wanted to focus on within these watersheds in the southern part of the ecoregion. So that includes Ventura, LA, Riverside, San Bernardino, Orange, and San Diego counties. And so we looked at it from a watershed perspective to start, and we've had to narrow down from here, but I just wanted to give you, this was our starting perspective as to what we wanted to focus on. And we thought what was really important was a wildland urban interface focus. There's been a lot of attention, I think, on coastal impacts of climate change and climate adaptation. But in the wildland urban interface, that's really where issues with the greatest issues are with fire risk and water sustainability, folks who are on well water. Those are all big limitations for folks who live in the backcountry, and in particular, rural communities, as well as the adjacent natural lands. This is where the interface is, where we have challenges and conflicts, but I think also have opportunity. So that's why one of the reasons that we made our focus here. However, with this watershed-based approach that I'll talk more about as I go, we think that there are implications for our urban and coastal areas that are going to be very relevant. So if you feel like you're more urban and you're worried this won't apply to you, I think there's information that will be valuable to all. So as I mentioned, we did have time and funding constraints. So from that original starting perspective of watersheds, we had to narrow a bit more. So everything you see in the two different colors of blue on this screen are the final watersheds that we are doing our work in. So the areas that are darker blue are areas where we'll have enhanced water data. So our watershed modeling is fairly intensive, and we couldn't complete it all in the time allotted, given the intensity of the modeling and the data constraints. So the dark blue is where we'll have full complement of watershed data. However, we'll have a baseline information and more generalized information for every single watershed you see outlined here. And how we selected these was not haphazard. We used a bunch of information to inform our selection. So we thought about the land use in these areas and how that was distributed, about the the amount of wildland urban interface, how much land was tribal reservations for some of our tribal partners, how much was conserved, how much had been part of the connectivity work that informed the start of this project. And then we also thought about institutional propensity. And so that's really focused on the jurisdictions. And the idea there was to find out who was already doing some of this work that might be early adopters and could help demonstrate how this could be used. And then those who may be in greatest need of this information, for example, if you're in the midst of a plan update. So that also helped us select where we thought our information would have the greatest impact. So now I'm just going to go through each of the teams and sort of give you the update on where we are now and a little bit of a view of where we're going, because again, this has really been informed by the stakeholder feedback efforts that we conducted at the beginning of 2019. And so in each case, I'm going to go through each of the teams separately, but in each case, you'll see a word cloud on the left-hand side of the screen. That is some of the information. That word cloud was generated from the stakeholder feedback effort. So you can get a sense for some of the big issues that people, or the big, topics or words that kept coming up during that feedback session. So quickly, I will acknowledge that our fire team is made up of Doug Stowe, Emmanuel Story, and Krista West from San Diego State University, Alexandra Seifert from SAGE Underwriters and the Conservation Biology Institute, and Aaron Conlisk from Point Blue Conservation. Let's see. All right, I keep having to move my, move my video so I can read my screen. All right, so the main things that we're focused on covering for the wildfire assessment, and I'll talk about these and demonstrate some data in a moment, our burn area and fire history, really refining that information to help guide more accurate data on the other topics we're interested in. So specifically, those other things are distribution and expansion of non-native herbaceous vegetation. So that has both ecological and fire risk implications for our communities. So we wanted to better understand that. The effects of herb expansion on biodiversity and fire regime. Regional post-fire chaparral recovery, so we could understand how recovery might be affected by climate change in areas where we could perhaps focus attention to mitigate fire risk or improve ecological conditions where recovery was not what we would hope. And then finally, looking at patterns of fire damage by home price to understand more about the spatial and socioeconomic implications of fire risk. So I'm going to go through just a little bit of, these are preliminary images from our teams. And this is sort of these are the types of information that you might expect out of our teams. So as I mentioned, refining the burn area and fire history really informs post-fire recovery. And so the idea here is our team's looking at a number of different fires across Southern California in recent history. And one of the first steps that they need to do is better understand the footprint of those fires, because what is currently mapped in terms of CAL FIRE perimeter maps is a bit coarser than what it actually looks like on the ground. And we need that refined information to get a better sense of fire severity and post-fire recovery. So those are important and connected steps. So they're using some remote sensing techniques to better understand that, and then to inform how past change and projected future change may be affected by this post-fire recovery. So for mapping and monitoring of herbaceous vegetation, they're using remote sensing techniques, but also using some field-based reconnaissance to validate that information to get a better handle on the cover of grasses and forbs. So in particular, non-native vegetation that affects fire spread, ignition probability, and can change fire risk and ecological integrity in our open spaces. And then finally, the patterns of fire damage by home price. We're interested in this, again, because our rural communities, oftentimes home prices are slightly lower than in our coastal communities. Did that differentially affect where structures were lost during a fire? And you can see, in red here, shaded red are fire perimeters, and then homes that burned in red and unburned structures in green. And in looking at a model of the data, you can see there does appear to be, based on the preliminary data, a difference between the price of unburned and burned homes. So burned homes tend to be at a lower price. Now this model includes things like the year of the sale and the individual fire, and then important drivers of fire dynamics like topography and land cover. But we were interested in this topic to see if that could better inform how we think about risk and equity. All right. So moving on to watershed assessment. Again, on the left-hand side, you can see some of the words that came up most frequently during our stakeholder feedback sessions. And this team is made up of folks from the Civil and Environmental Engineering Department at San Diego State University, Alicia Kinoshita, Jack Mike Sell, and Sarah Mago. And their focus, first and foremost, has been on establishing a framework. So calibration and measurements of stream flow, infiltration, runoff, and erosion. So how can we get accurate information about that? And then how can we assess water supply? So the water that's available in the environment and how those conditions change under various scenarios. Then to look at water use, that's use from the human perspective, identification of high-risk watersheds. I'll talk a bit more about what that is. And then finally, stormwater, how management impacts can affect volume and pollutant loads. So how to better assess how those things may change. So the work this team is doing starts by defining hydrologic units, putting together information such as slope, land cover, which can be vegetation or urban cover, as well as soil group, and then putting that into a model where inputs into the system, or the balance of what goes into the system, rainfall and evapotranspiration, results in stream flow or outputs in the system. And then they're calibrating that information using actual stream flow measurements from USGS gauges. And so here you can see a sample of what those data look like. So in the graph here, the initial model is in blue, and then they calibrate that information using those gauges, and they get a lot closer to the observed. So it's really, the idea here is just to improve accuracy of these models so we can get a better sense of things like loading and production. So for loading, looking at stream flow, sediment load, total nitrogen, zinc, and copper loading. And then for production, how much runoff, the runoff ratio, sediment production, as well as the nitrogen, zinc, and copper coming out of the system. And in addition, you'll see, these are for a specific water year, and for, you can model what that looks like under an individual storm. We have some overall watershed characteristics. So this is really a flexible approach that allows looking at the dynamics, the true dynamics of the system, and can get some information. You can see this as by water year, peak flows that may come out of a system, for example. And the goal here, moving forward, so they've been working to establish this baseline and this framework, is to create a time series and maps under future disturbance scenarios. So to think about how those dynamics may change under land use cover change, wildfire effects, prolonged drought, and increased frequency of extreme precipitation induced by climate change. And then to evaluate the impacts on habitat from changes in water availability and water quality under future disturbance scenarios. So that's really starting to integrate data with our other teams. And then risk characterization of these impacts at the watershed scale. So risk from a perspective of thinking about stream flow volume, depth, and pollutant loads under different scenarios. And then finally, we have our biodiversity and conserved lands. I am working on that team along with Rebecca Lewison, our postdoctoral researcher, Isabel Rojas Viada. And then we have joining our team, Mark de Guzman, who is collaborating with us with a UC Davis and US Forest Service team on the carbon work. So I'm gonna move along a little bit more quickly so we have time to answer questions, but we wanna, from the connectivity perspective, visit that connectivity information that we've gathered and look at the condition of regional landscape linkages. Based on some of this information from our water team and our fire team. We're doing an analysis of climate refugia under both extreme temperature and drought conditions, trying to get a better sense of how we can better plan for recreational access that minimizes conservation impacts. This is something we heard a lot during our stakeholder feedback sessions. Talk more about that in a minute. And then carbon sequestration, again, this came out of our stakeholder feedback to better assess above and below ground carbon stocks. And then finally, working with our tribal partners to do a cultural assessment to better assess the value of linkages, the multiple benefit of protecting linkages to also protect culturally important species and places. So to identify climate refugia, we're thinking about sites that experience less anthropogenic warming or less change during extreme events like heat waves and drought. and assessing the landscape variation in warming rates, drought impacts, the intensity of events, and then the features associated with that variation, so we can incorporate that into planning and make sure those areas are protected. And so when we say, you know, what is climate refugia? What is refuge from climate? Well, it's in things that may experience lesser, lower temperatures under the most extreme events. So this is an example under a scenario of 70 years, 70 different time steps. What areas fall within the lowest extreme under those time steps, or are under the most extreme conditions, under the highest extreme. And then for refuge from drought, we're thinking about things like climatic water deficit intensity. So in this map, the red would be most intense water deficit, and the palest color is least amount. And you can see, based on historical data, that can really vary across the landscape, and even within a landscape, the frequency at which something provides a refuge from drought may vary. So this site in the box here doesn't hold up under an extreme condition in extreme drought condition in 2018. And then thinking into the future, we're looking at models of projected climate change, and we see in some cases across the landscape intensity of this, or the scale of an event, may vary. So for example, on the left-hand side in 2083, you see a region-wide event, whereas in 2085, in this example, there's a lot more variation across the landscape. So really understanding the localized and regional impacts of extreme events and creating refuge from those things. For our recreational analysis, one of the things we're doing is looking at existing conserved lands. So in green are areas that are open access protected lands, purple, no public access, and in maroon, restricted access. How do those things vary and affect you know, our conservation targets? And then where can we allow for recreation that may minimize the impacts on our important conservation goals? So we're also, in addition to lands that are already protected or considered conserved in one way or another, whether they're open or access or not, to look at areas that have not yet been conserved and where are there opportunities, if they become part of our conservation landscape, to allow for recreational access, understanding that that's critically important for buy-in and for the well-being and health of our communities. So really allowing people to use these spaces, but in a way that minimizes the impact. And then finally, our carbon stock estimation. As I mentioned, this is something that we added on to the project, and is in collaboration with the US Forest Service and UC Davis, looking at information from the literature. How can that inform how we go about assessing carbon stocks, specifically in chaparral vegetation types? And then combining that baseline information from the literature with remote sensing, vegetation maps, and thinking about things like fire-driven vegetation conversion to understand the dynamics of carbon storage in a fire-prone environment, post-fire and in places where we have more frequent fire. And then finally, we have our planning integration. So again, this is sort of the vehicle or the process of integration into practice. And that team consists of Sherry Ryan, Diane Foote, and Becca Smith, all at San Diego State. And the work they've been doing is to get a sense of jurisdictional planning status, who has what kinds of plans, a plan review to figure out what is in those plans, or how are people already incorporating these things, where are opportunities to insert this information, and then to better figure out how people go about their planning process. So we've conducted a planner survey, and I'll show you some results from that. And moving forward, we're going to be hosting a technical advisory group to sort of help us test out these products I'm showing you and figure out how to best integrate individual data products as well as an integrated data product. So we can really figure out where the opportunities are for that integration. So in our planner survey, we had a good response of over 100 folks, a lot from cities, consultants who work with jurisdictional planning in cities and counties, our metropolitan planning organizations, councils of governments, so on and so forth, nonprofits, the county. We had some great tribal responses, and then a few state and federal, although the planning perspective is less focused on state and federal planning. And we also had good representation from different perspectives of planning. So a lot of environmental, land use, and planning, climate planning backgrounds, but also folks involved in more of the human side of things, so the transportation, development services, and housing. So I think we had a good mix there. And I think really encouraging to see that the vast majority of the respondents did consider biodiversity, wildfire risk, and water sustainability in their planning practice. And while fewer said that they incorporated carbon sequestration, a number were very interested in how they could incorporate carbon sequestration. So then finally, we wanted to know what were the impediments for trying to integrate new information about this type of data or tools into the work of practicing jurisdictional planners. And it was a lot of things about how we actually provide the data, the ease of use, funding for tools and data availability were the three top answers. So our hope is to fill that gap and better answer some of those things. All right. So we have one more Mentimeter question that I'll give you a quick preview of what's to come, and then I'd like to flip over to questions. So let's go, let me open the question for Mentimeter here. Oops, I gotta move this. Open voting. You know what, I'm gonna skip this one. I didn't leave quite enough time. You can feel, you know what, want to go ahead and answer this one if you like, and then I'm gonna open this one as well. So we'd really like to know how you see yourself using this information. So go ahead and answer those. And actually, while you answer, I'm gonna give you a preview of what we're gonna be doing next. So I'll come back and visit these responses in a moment. So go ahead and answer, and I'll tell you what's coming next so we have plenty of time for questions. So what's next? Well, our team is going to continue working on these data sets, and importantly, really focusing on how we can not only deliver individual data products in a way that is most useful, but also figuring out how to integrate that information. So perhaps it could be one-stop shopping if that's something that's of interest to you. So how can we deliver tools, decision-making support, workshops, work with you to figure out how the best way to get this information integrated into your practice. We'll be providing a summary report that is really directed at application and those who want to implement this work. And then finally, to cap everything off, we'll be hosting a climate summit with the Climate Science Alliance. And that'll be at the end of the project, I think in about March of 2021. And also in the following summer, we'll have there'll be a Tribal Climate Summit where we'll also be talking about some of the results of this work. So those are some things coming up. The planner survey that I mentioned, if this is the first time you're hearing about it and you are a jurisdictional planner, never fear, there's still time to hear from you. So feel free to join. We're going to keep that survey open until May 15th. So the results I show you could be preliminary if you want to log in and share your thoughts. Or if you'd like to join our technical advisory group. So with that group, we hope to have 3 or 4 meetings over the next year or so and address topics about, you know, how we could plan for climate resiliency. We'll be doing data review and development, thinking about planning tool development to make sure that what we're producing and delivering is meeting people where they are. And then finally, a great opportunity for innovative outreach led by our Climate Science Alliance team, Amber Paris, Alex Warnicki, Diane Terry, and Lindsay Jaspers to integrate this information into the Climate Kids program that really works with K through 12 education to integrate this information into the existing modules or perhaps create a new Climate Kids module to help bring this information into our communities, as well as art and community approaches. And to that end, we actually have a summer climate art fellowship that's open for applications right now. We're gonna have artists come work with our team over the summer to help translate and communicate our science to our communities and make it more accessible to everyone. And hopefully to continue reaching out to, we've reached over 600 people thus far, and we have over 100 on the line today. So that our goal is really to continue this. At the end of this webinar, you'll have an opportunity to give us some feedback if this format worked for you. And so we might do more virtual interactions, but we'll also be doing some in-person interactions as we move forward. And then finally, we'll have some project team updates coming to our website soon. So you'll be able to find a place to log in and see where we are. and have an opportunity to get more real-time updates from each of our teams. So with that, I'm going to flip back and see what folks thought about how they might use this. Whoa, everything fell apart. Here we go. That's an interesting dynamic there. Oh, pretty well. I'm glad to see not very many not sure yet. So hopefully we can convince you if you're not sure yet how you might use this, but looks like a good distribution among folks who want to share, educate others, who want to use it in future planning projects or inform policies and decision making. Great. I mean, we hope to deliver this in all aspects. So it's really nice to see this good distribution of people who want to use this in different ways. And here I'm going to step back and see if folks answered what does resilience mean to you? Oh, fantastic. Adaptability, sustainability, recovery. I think this is really important. We don't use resilience in our technical scientific jargon because it is somewhat vague, but I think that's actually the benefit of using it in these formats because it can mean a lot of different things to a lot of different people. And it's really fantastic to see how you all perceive it and what you think of it, because I think this is part of what we're trying to do with this project. So I'll leave this up while we answer some of the questions so you can see if any other answers roll in. Diane, do we have some questions queued up that I can work to answer? We've got about 17 minutes left.
We do. Let's see. The first question is, what is institutional propensity and what does the number tell us?
Great, good question. I swung by that fairly quickly in the interest of time. So we developed the term institutional propensity, and the idea behind that was to get a sense for the likelihood of uptake. What was the propensity for different jurisdictions or institutions to be receptive to the information that we were providing and potentially want to integrate it into their work? And that was critical for us because we wanted to know who we could get on board early, who might be champions, or who we could best direct our efforts to, who might be in greatest need. So what went into that number was things like who has climate action plans, who's incorporated things like conservation and natural spaces and climate change into their existing plans, who's doing plan updates. Higher score just means we think there might be higher propensity. We're not leaving anybody behind, so never fear if you're in a jurisdiction that may have gotten a lower score. I didn't show those results, but it was really a tool for us to better understand how to reach people and who might be in greatest need of the type of work that we're doing.
We have another question. How are you addressing potential or direct adverse effects on historic built environment, archaeological and tribal cultural resources as part of this effort? If not right now, how do you plan to address this in the future?
If I understand correctly, the intent of that question, so we are not directly working on what the adverse effects are on cultural resources or archaeological sites in the work that we are doing here. However, one of the things that we are working with our tribal partners on is how to elevate concerns they have about not only reservation lands, but all the traditional lands, which is basically all of Southern California, and how to elevate those concerns in a variety of formats. So not just when there are ground disturbing activities or there are activities that may cross reservation boundaries. We don't have an exact answer for that yet because we want to do some more information gathering, and this is something that will be moved forward in collaboration with our tribal partners so we can better understand needs and interests. But hopefully that answers the question that that is something we are talking about and thinking about. Don't have an exact plan at this moment in time, but I'm very aware that there are impacts from all of these things, and we would like to help elevate those concerns where appropriate.
Okay, next question is, how are you considering the economic opportunities for the community that could support and benefit this full network?
Yes, good question. We did not incorporate an economist into this project. I definitely think that is a next important step, because for a community to be sustainable, they have to have economic opportunities. And I think that's perhaps a next step for this project, is to do an economic assessment of how these different activities could support persistence and thriving in our communities, but by minimizing impacts to our natural spaces. How can we be more compatible, create opportunities that are sustainable and compatible with the vision of what Southern California could be, and in some places is, where we have a good balance between our natural spaces and our local communities.
Next question is, will you be collaborating with Sandag and End Extinction San Diego?
Yes, we are. Sandag actually has been a partner from the beginning, as has SCAG. If you were up in the Southern California Association of Governments region, we have a lot of partners. Sandag will actually be, we will have a representative from Sandag on our resilience team. And I think in terms of the End Extinction San Diego, as much information as we can provide that would be valuable to that effort as it continues to develop, we're happy to do that. The goal here is really to work with as many folks as want to be thinking about resilience, climate adaptation, both in our natural and human communities.
Okay, we have another question about our outreach. ABC faces doing community outreach or art-led outreach. How do you see the Art Fellowship addressing these issues?
I'm sorry, the voice broke up a little bit at the beginning. Could you repeat the beginning, Diane?
What are the largest challenges that CWC faces when doing community outreach or art?
Oh, now I lost you at the end. I think I got the gist of it. So biggest challenges in doing community outreach. I think one of the biggest challenges is every community is different. What folks are interested in each community, what speaks to them, what their greatest concerns and needs are, differ. And there's no one size fits all. So we try to be responsive to that in all the outreach that we do, trying to outreach in different formats, in different ways, in different places. If you feel like there's an opportunity that we have missed, we'd be more than happy to have my cat help you. Excuse the meowing. We'd be more than happy to entertain any suggestions or input that you have specifically, if you'd like to recommend something that we have not yet done to better reach a particular community. But we do try to get out there in a lot of different ways. And I really see the art as the Art Fellowship as a way to reach people in a different way. I'm a scientist and I speak like a scientist a lot of times, and but I love to see the art translation, how somebody takes the science that we're working on and puts it into an image that takes it to a whole different place. I always think that is just so, it brings so much more life to what we do. I think it makes it so much more real and tangible, and hopefully that helps reach more communities. I would say in addition to the Art Fellowship, one really cool thing that happens in the Climate Kids program that the Alliance leads is that the kids do art projects as well. And the great thing about that is that's art coming out of every community. So every community where Climate Kids is currently infused, those kids create the art. So while our art fellowship will be coming from a single artist, that the children's art comes from all their various perspectives from the communities that they live in and their personal lived experiences.
Okay, a question about our data. Will the data be available in categories-based watersheds, and how will we access data for specific areas?
Great. So if I understand the first part of the question, data will be, we will have individual data products that come from each of our teams. So if that's the first part of the question in terms of, will you be able to access just fire or just water data? The answer is yes. If the question is more along the lines of, will you be able to access it by watershed? In some cases, yes, not all the data will be something that fits within a watershed. So for example, a fire may burn, for example, over more than one watershed. So some things will be at different extents or scales or resolutions, but yes, we will do what we can to make it available by watershed or jurisdiction. And then in terms of, I think part of the question was also accessibility of data. We're still working on that. So that was actually a big part of, and one of the motivations for our planner survey is, we know there are a lot of tools that emerge out there that don't necessarily get used because it's a crowded space, and a lot of folks, if you already have a way that you do your work, sometimes it just makes sense to continue along that path. So one of the things that we want to try to do is meet people where they are. And so one of the questions in that planner survey is, what tools are already at your disposal that you use? How do you do your work? And so we saw a lot of answers. I was not expecting this, but a lot of people are strictly using geographic information system, ArcGIS, for example, or interactive information. So we don't have a firm answer about how we're going to deliver. My goal is to deliver in several different ways so that regardless of how you do your work, it's accessible. As you can see, we already use some of the Esri tools. The folks who produce ArcGIS story maps and interactive web maps. And when you create an interactive web map, the information is also available via Arc Online. So I think that will be one format, but we're also looking at some of the other, integrating into some of the other planning tools that are in use across the region. Did I hit all the pieces there, Diane?
Sorry?
Did I hit all the pieces there?
You did.
Okay.
We have a question from one of our planners. What is the overall time frame for this project, and how often will the TAG, the Technical Advisory Group, be meeting regularly or at key deliverables?
Yes. Okay. So the timeline, well, given our current situation, that might be shifting a little bit. Our current end date is the end of March 2021. We may drift into the end of June there. We'll see. We were trying to keep moving, but I know for a lot of you, it's been challenging. It's been a little bit challenging for some of us as well. The Technical Advisory Group, we have targeted 3 or 4 meetings before that current projected end date. I don't think it will be regularly scheduled. I think the latter is probably more likely, that as we have things to bring to you, we want to make best use of your time if you're participating in that group. As we have things to bring to you and gather your input so that it can then be reflected in how we shift what we're delivering or how we develop our tools and that sort of thing, it'll be more likely interspersed in terms of where we are in terms of production, but spaced out enough. I mean, I think we're shooting for our first meeting being in June. It might be virtual, so we all stay healthy, but I think that we're all getting used to interacting more virtually anyway. So
we have a question about our data. Is there a lifespan in mind for the maps that you are producing? Are they more a one-time product of this process or an ongoing resource, or do you know yet?
Good question. I think the way that we're producing these, that they will be useful for quite a long time. That said, I think any data about related to how things may change over time certainly can be updated. And you know, in the future, I could see potentially we revisit this and update some of the information, in particular as we see it put to use. But I think in the way that we are evaluating scenarios and potential for change, I think that gives this longevity. I think that gives us an opportunity to provide something that allows you to think about what the future might be without committing to something that we don't actually know what the future is going to be. None of us has a crystal ball. And so it allows us an opportunity to consider the range of what might happen and factor that in, given that there's always uncertainty in this kind of work.
Great. We have a comment from one of our guests and who would like you to comment on it.
Okay.
He said,
on a comment.
Great sweeping scope and data-rich effort to put everything into identify the critical path keeping Southern California environment intact. But most of us have limited time and technical capacity. The most critically important core areas and actions. How to get politicians to acknowledge these, whether natural land be considered for carbon sequestration for off-site offsets, use of remote carbon credits, which pushes the GHG reductions elsewhere. Comment.
Okay, great. Well, Diane, you broke up a little bit, so I'll sort of, I don't know if that was just for me or for others as well, so I'll try to restate part of the comment as I go. So how do we winnow this information down? We've got a bunch of different components. Great question. That is something that we are working on, because while I think some folks who perhaps work in certain arenas may want individual pieces of information out of each of our teams, I completely agree that sometimes it's daunting that we have so many things to consider. And that was actually one of the goals of this project. How could we synthesize this in a way that it becomes tractable? And so we are currently working on an approach. We're thinking of it as how we can combine these different domains of resilience or of refuge into a concept that may be helpful, where all the components are combined. We can look at where we might have climate refugia and opportunities to reduce fire risk and protect biodiversity all in the same place. How can we overlay those things, or where are those things next to each other where we may want to prioritize? Again, that was sort of the one-stop shop comment that I made earlier. Where can we combine these in a way, or how can we combine these in a way that you can sort of visit it and get an overall sense of the relative importance of these different areas for different components. However, that said, another side of what we're trying to do is make that customizable. So for example, if you care about all those things, but perhaps you work more on fire, you can maybe weight that more heavily. You can turn the knob and dial that in a way where that gets greater weight, so you could focus more on that. So that's one way that we're trying to integrate that information. With respect to considering carbon sequestration and offsets, I know there are folks who are interested in the work that we are doing and how that could potentially be, our information could be used for those purposes. And I definitely think that is potentially a path forward. You know, a lot of places where we have conservation plans, the plans are in place and they've been that way for a while. How do we add new places to that list? Well, I think potentially carbon offsets or mitigation credits moving forward may be the way that we prioritize lands that weren't included in initial conservation plans that are important. So I think that may be an important mechanism to recognize and prioritize protection of some of these key important areas. I think I hit most of that, yeah?
I think so. Okay. Educators, what are the biggest takeaway for educators? What information do you think is most important for educators to communicate?
Good question. I think that might be something for our Climate Science Alliance team, because one of the things they're great at is taking this science and then synthesizing it in a way that it's accessible for both educators and their students. But I think really just the sense that this is all, I think one of the important takeaways and important components to come out of this will be that we're all connected. All these different disciplines are connected, these different factors in the landscape are connected. We as humans are connected to our landscape. You know, you read about nature deficit disorder, and I think we need to increase awareness that we are all connected, and how we experience climate change is mitigated through the environment, and how we adapt will also be mitigated through the environment. To be resilient, we must focus on how we interact with our natural systems and you know, do it in a complementary fashion rather than something in conflict. So I think those will probably be some of the key elements to come out of this. And hopefully that will come out in a way that our climate kids can grasp onto. And I know that our Climate Science Alliance team will do a great job of translating that.
Okay, we have two questions about.
So we're actually at noon.
Oh, okay.
Do you think they're quick questions?
There's two that are kind of the same. It should be quick.
Okay.
Data and efforts project on where plan changed or plan, and will your efforts be reflected in regional orders and regulations, including CEQA review?
So again, you're breaking up a little bit. So have data and efforts conducted by this project had an impact on where planners changed or updated plans? So not yet, because we are still in the process of developing the data, but my hope is yes, that we will affect the way that planning is done. We certainly have a lot of folks interested in integrating this work. And then the second question was, how will data and maps generated through this project be made available for integration and use? Oh no, sorry. You asked a question about CEQA, right? Here we go.
Right, it's just, will your effort reflected?
Yeah, so will your efforts be reflected in regional ordinances and regulations, including CEQA review? My hope is yes. I think it starts with integrating into planning processes, but I think that's an important next step is, you know, infusing this into other things that we do. CEQA is a big one, and so I would like to see this get there eventually, but it'll require help from those of you that work in these arenas. Our team is mostly researchers, so we don't often have the opportunity to fully affect that change, but we hope that in working with you, we can. So I see there are more questions rolling in. I think we can capture those. If you have a question that pops up afterward, we have, can we put that link on our website, Diane?
Yes,
right?
we can.
We have a forum where you can continue to submit questions. If your question wasn't answered, never fear. We will answer everything and post it online, because I know there wasn't time to get to everybody, but I hope you have found this useful. I really appreciated the engagement and your thoughts on this. And with that, we will sign off. Again, you can visit the recording on the website and register your questions on the website if they haven't gotten answered. Let's see. So thank you everybody for joining us. Oh, somebody wants me to introduce my cat. He ran away and the other one's sleeping in the corner. All right, so I think with that, we will sign off. Thank you all so much for your time, for joining us. Please continue to stay involved. If you're not on our mailing list, please join, because we would like to continue hearing from you. Our success depends on your input and feedback, because our goal is to really serve you and meet your needs. So thank you all for joining us and hope to connect with you all soon, be it virtually or in person, hopefully both.